thing working? Probably, yes. Okay. Well, I need to ask a couple of questions too because I gave this at the history conference last fall. And I know that I recognize some faces, a lot of faces here. And did you all hear about Frank Young last fall? Or is this going to be a new story about the man who lived up in the mountains above Gold Creek? Is there anybody to whom this is a new story? Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, see, I've picked up a lot of information since then, so I was going to adapt it so you didn't sound like instant replay or months later replay or whatever. But Frank Young was a subject of some interest to me. I heard about him, more than 30 years ago now. A friend of mine who was a game warden he was my hiking partner, and he told me that he'd been hiking in the mountains up behind Gold Creek, and he came on this little shack back in a curve of the hills, and he didn't even know anybody was living up there. And there was a fresh deer hanging outside, and it was not hunting season, and he was in uniform. So he went up and he knocked on the door, and an old man answered and just looked at him, white-faced in fear. And he said they just stared at each other for a while, and finally Mike said, "Aren't you going to offer me a cup of coffee?" And the guy invited him in and poured him a cup of coffee out of a pot that the grounds were so thick there was barely room for a single cup of coffee in the pot. He said it was just horrible stuff. And they sat there and chatted for a while, and he drank the horrible coffee, and then he left. And he didn't bother him because he knew the difference between poaching and subsistence, as I think a lot of you folks understand. My father might have done a little subsistence when I was a kid. Actually, my mother was the guiltiest party because fool hens are so stupid, and she would hit them with rocks, and they'd run a few steps to see if she was going to hit them again. She did. That's completely off the point, which I do a lot of. Anyway, Mike told me that the cabin had just this one room, and there was an army helmet hanging on the back wall, and some clothes that kind of hinted at a military past. And then I didn't hear about him for a while, and some folks in Deer Lodge approached me and said I should go up and interview him, do an oral history on him. But I don't like intruding on people. Some of you have mentioned my column. You'll notice there aren't a lot of names in there. Sometimes I put names in, but I always ask the people first because it's their story, and I don't want to, butt into their lives if they don't want to butt it into. And I declined to go. And I thought he was a hermit. That was in error on my part. So there were a lot of rumors about him, and he was a prospector, not a gold miner. The thrill was in the chase. And he'd work in the mines or work at the ranches every year for enough money to pay for his flour and beans and tobacco to get him through the winter. Like most prospectors, there were rumors that he had a secret stash of gold hidden somewhere in the mountains we all know about. I don't think my dad did. Anyway, so I began to form a mental picture of him, and I pictured this weazened old guy, kind of bent and irascible and taciturn. And then in 2002, he died. And I thought, darn, I should have gone and talked to him. And I should have, because I've learned a lot since then. He was born in Stockton, California in 1919. Had a couple of sisters, Rose and Tressa, and a younger brother, Joseph. And Joseph went by the name of Frank's stepfather, Joseph Burgone. And Burgone Sr. was middle-aged when he married Frank's mother and was apparently quite harsh with Frank. One of the earliest stories I heard about him, and it seemed to become a pattern for Frank, is that he was sent to drive the wagon down to Gold Creek to sell eggs at the little store there. The horse bolted and the eggs were broken. Charlie Brand told me a lot about Frank. His grandmother found Frank, 10 years old, huddled in the wagon seat, just shivering with fear over the punishment he knew he was going to get when he went back and divulged that the eggs were broken. So she gently led him out to the hen house and gave him eggs to cover the loss. He wasn't helpless. He was a hard worker. He'd turn his hand to anything that would help him get by. I think his gentle disposition just didn't give him the strength he needed against his stepfather. Finally, another neighbor, Klaus Wohlers, confronted his stepfather and said, "Stop being so rough on Frank." The man replied he'd do as he pleased with his own son, but he didn't. Frank left with Klaus and began kind of a different life down there in Gold Creek. He found shelter and help when he needed it, but it's an exaggeration to say they adopted him or that he became part of the family. He was just Frank. He was there sometimes he wasn't. The old-timers in Gold Creek could be pretty tough because it's a tough life up there. But it's a toughness that comes from surviving the hard times. The local store extended him credit, knowing full well they would probably never be paid. The owner told her daughter in no uncertain terms that Frank was always to be given leave to sign for his purchases. And his needs were very, very small, amazingly small. In the end, although the tab had added up perhaps as high as $700, and that's a lot of money for a little store, he paid off every part of that debt, but that's a later part of the story. So time passed, he grew up, became a prospector. He also worked in the mines, local ranches, and in some ways you can divide his story into two phases, before and after World War II. And I discount the years with his stepfather, his Gold Creek life and after World War II. When I started to piece the story together, I talked to a lot of people who remembered him. He was short. He was tall. He was quiet and solitary. He liked to sing and dance and play the guitar, especially after a couple of beers. And at times I wondered if they were remembering the same man, because if you've been in the hills around here, you know there are a lot of old cabins. And there were other old guys that lived up there alone. And I thought they might have mixed him up with somebody else. And across the canyon from where Frank lived, there was another one-room cabin, and it was the home of an equally solitary miner. Some people knew him pretty well, and I lucked out when I found that the archivist at Grant Coors Ranch, where I've worked since 1976, was Klaus Wohlers' daughter. So the stories began to emerge. Peggy remembered that Frank was tall. Another friend recalled him being short, but Peggy's 5'3". The other friend is 6 feet tall. So that helped me keep in mind that my stories were coming from different times, ages, and perspectives. Buildings on a ranch are pretty organic. You know, a shed will be put up for a particular need. Time passes, you don't need it, it falls into disuse. And the old bunkhouse at the Wohlers' place became Frank's temporary home whenever he wanted to come down from the mountain and stay closer to people, maybe to get work or whatever. Sometimes he'd stay up on top of that mountain, and I've been up there. I don't know how he did it. He'd stay up there all winter. He generally had the companionship of a dog. I'm going to throw this side story in because there are so many stories that people just make up. It's a local story in Deer Lodge that he'd start the winter with 6 dogs and come out of it with 1. You know, and that's a pretty, it's funny, but it's kind of a nasty story too. However, one winter he came down, all the way down through the snow on snowshoes, and said he was down to just flour and salt. And Klaus said, getting pretty hungry up there? And he said, no, but the dog wouldn't eat it. So I don't believe that story. He had a pretty good sense of humor. He liked to tease. Dixie Wohlers Henderson said that she was often the butt of his humor. He babysat her on occasion when she was little, and he said that was the reason he never married. I asked if, he named the dog Dixie, by the way, and I asked if she knew about the dog, and she said no, but her mother had owned a horse named Dixie, and her father always told her she'd been named after her mother's horse. On March 23rd, 1944, Frank was inducted into the Army under Selective Service Order S591. And his basic training must have been really basic, because 3 months later, he was in a glider. Makes me sad. I don't like to tell his story. Landing in Normandy the night before D-Day. And, I just know too much about that stuff now. How many of you followed it on the anniversary of D-Day? There was a ton of, it just breaks your heart what you read about it. And that's what makes me so mad when I hear that he was a deserter, because he was not a deserter. The only time anybody ever remembered him being angry was over what happened that night, because apparently they dropped some men out to parachute out at 250 feet above the ground. Those old chutes didn't have time to open when you jumped at 250 feet above the ground, and he was mad about it years later. I think I like happy stories better than sad stories. Can I tell you about my cat Twitter? Yeah. Oh, well. So he didn't desert at Normandy. So I still didn't know what became of him after that, and so I thought, well, maybe after Normandy he deserted, since I'd heard that story so much. No, the Battle of the Bulge occurred, and that was the last major German offensive, counteroffensive, and it was beaten back by January 1945, and at some point, a bullet hit his helmet. He was not critically injured, but tiny fragments from the helmet stayed in his skull for the rest of his life. So did he desert then? No. He didn't desert. Deserters aren't buried at Fort Harrison. Deserters don't get the Eastern Theater of Operations ribbon with 2 battle stars, They don't get the Purple Heart. He did his duty. But while he was in the trenches at the Battle of the Bulge, he swore that if he lived through it, he was going back where he was happy, and that was Gold Creek. And he did, and he stayed there. He prospected a lot. Dixie said she looked over a broad expanse of land one time. It looked like a prairie dog town because there were little holes dibbled everywhere, He knew the land, and he knew how to prospect, so he made a little color every once in a while, and sometimes he'd come down to Gold Creek on a spree, buy a couple of beers. Peggy said he loved to dance, and whenever he started singing, the girls all hid. He'd just drink a couple of beers. There was coffee, and there is a rumor, still unconfirmed, that there was a year-round spring underneath the cabin that a friend of his used to get watered for a still. But that's another story, and I don't know if it's true. His story is a real patchwork of these recollections from people. And the true story, the hard copy stuff that archivists like. I'm not being disrespectful. I love the archives here. It's not there. It went up in flames. In 1950, they built a new archive for the military records in St. Louis, and in 1973, it burned. And between 16 and 18 million military personnel records were lost. So 85% of the records of soldiers discharged between 1912 and 1959 were lost at that time. His records were among them. So my interest in him became serious when I made plans to give this talk last year. And the Forest Service, they were looking into it too, because his cabin was part of what might be a historic district up there. I was going to go up in the spring as soon as snow got off enough that I could get there, because this is an impossible place. And it was not until July that I was able to get up there. I'm going to show you, let's see, a couple of pictures. Like I said, I don't use that thing. 40-some years ago, I was standing in front of 300 people in Yosemite National Park about to show a slideshow, and it went, boom. So I said, we're going to sing some camp songs. And I've never done a slideshow since then. I'll pass this around so you can take a look. This is not the view from his cabin, but it's almost identical from the view he would have had up there in those mountains. And you'll notice I've never said exactly where it is. I'm letting the place rest in peace, sort of. And this is the view he would have had looking up, but this is just the start. So I'll pass that around. You can take a look at it. So I got there, and that isn't the view that I found. This is the view that I found. The cabin had been burned down that winter. Fire. And there was some justification to it. It was pretty derelict. It wasn't a patented claim. You know, different people have different, but the information that was lost there. You know, people, when I'm looking for information, I think they're afraid I want to get their family photos or their letters. I don't want things, I want information. And that information is no longer available because it's a pile of ash. Luckily, the helmet with the bullet hole was saved by his nephew, who is elusive somewhere. I'm going to pass around, it's a bad picture of Frank. It was an old Polaroid, and when I'm done with this, I'll pass around a painting that was done from it. There's his helmet. He's sitting there on his cot. You can see it's not exactly a very elegant place. There's a poem on the wall there, and I'll pass that around later. You can see his, in the one I'll pass around later, you'll see his lantern now lying in the ashes up on the mountain, hanging on the wall. But that was kind of a start of something. Here's some of his china. Does anybody remember Mother's Oats? It was a Quaker Oats hot cereal, and you could save the labels and turn them in for china. So he had Mother's Oats china up there. I can't picture him with this flowery stuff, but Peggy told me her mother got it and gave it to him. So you can take a look at those things. But what happened after I got done with this program was kind of odd. I really wanted to find a European Theater of Operations ribbon, and that's what this represents here, to represent his service there. And I hunted and hunted and hunted. And in my basement, I found an European Theater of Operations ribbon that belonged to the man who owned the house before me, and it had been abandoned after he died. And down in that basement, along with his other stuff, which I'd never looked at, was his logbook with his flights to Egypt, and England, and down in Africa. Stuff that was just in the basement. The people I bought the house from didn't have time to throw it out before I moved in. Something that could have gotten lost. And anyone is welcome to look at this as well. It makes kind of interesting reading. It's pretty sparse, but every once in a while there's just a note, Lieutenant so-and-so shot down today, you know, and not pleasant reading. But it shows a life that went on that nobody really knew about with this man who lived very quietly in a small cabin in Deer Lodge afterwards. And there were other things in the box, his dog tags. So that was a history that could start to be reconstructed because there was some documentation for it. And for some reason at that point things just started to come to me, and some of you may have seen these. The medal for service before we entered the war in '39, and the medal after that. This one was found on a dump in Kalispell. That life's been thrown away. People were able to reconstruct Frank's life for me, largely. Those records were able to construct Jan Stewart's life for me, largely. This life is not going to be reconstructible. We could make something up. We'll never know. But I think that if we look into our own basements and boxes of detritus, that a lot of us will find bits of history that maybe we want to get preserved somewhere along the line, because if those people had stayed in my house any longer, they would have thrown away a 13th century Japanese Buddha, all of Jan Stewart's records, photographs from all over the world from the 1940s, because not everybody sees history the same way we do, as, you know, part of our own ongoing lives. Anyway, let's see. What else have we got here? Does anybody know what this one is? I keep meaning to look it up. Blue, plain blue field with gold around the outside. I'll look it up someday. Did you know that you can Google it? Do you know how much misinformation there is when you Google things? Good. I use the internet to lead me to original documents in archives. It's a lot safer. Okay. There is one other thing. A couple of more things, actually. I had a bunch of things from his cabin, but I gave it to the Forest Service, and they're keeping it in their collection. So Frank will be preserved by them, too. One theory is that he had PTSD. You know, we hear a lot about PTSD, and I believe it. You know, I had some experience in the Far East back in the 60s, and it stays with you. And that's probably a factor in what made Frank the way that he is. But I think that even before the war, he had narrowed his life down to a quiet, peaceful life that was exactly what he wanted. And he made a conscious decision not to run away from the world, but to return to the world that he loved and he wanted. So I don't think of him suffering up there. I like to think that he found the peace that he was looking for. He wasn't a big war hero. Who knows what he may have done over there? He didn't talk about it. Maybe he was a huge war hero. But he was just like us. We all have our own stories, and they all have a place in the archives of the Montana Historical Society and the photo archives and everything else, right? And really, to a large extent, that's what I have to say tonight. But I take questions, I take informational contributions, not money. I don't need money. I have a 50-pound sack of rice and 40 jars of choke cherry syrup in my basement, so I'm fine. Yes.